I never know what to do with my hands. Hello, and thank you for tuning into In Focus. I'm your host, Tim Silvia. I'm joined today by Harvard University History and Literature lecturer, Dr. Alex Corey. Dr. Corey is here with me to sit back and talk about his upcoming discussion on the historical consciousness of the music of Frank Ocean. The discussion will be tonight at 7 p.m. in the Mark Center. Dr. Corey, thank you, and welcome to In Focus. So first things first, what really quickly, or not quickly if you don't want to, was kind of your inspiration behind this discussion? Like, what really got the ball rolling for you?
This discussion came out of a variety of courses that I've taught in the last couple of years. A couple courses that I taught at CU Boulder, and then the classes that I'm teaching right now at Harvard University, in which I've been trying to put contemporary popular music in conversation with American literature and American history. The idea for talking about Frank Ocean in the context of the summer of 2016 came from the fact that his albums that people have been waiting for quite a while came out at the end of the summer of 2016. It had been a particularly eventful summer for folks who were involved in anti-racist activism and LGBTQ communities, and so I thought people were really familiar with what artists like Kendrick Lamar and Beyonce were doing in terms of their engagement with history, and were a little bit less familiar with what Frank Ocean was doing. Mm-hmm. And so I thought this would be a useful topic to introduce people to the study of popular music.
Okay. Could you quickly, because you use the term historical consciousness a lot, so could you quickly just kind of give like a little personal definition for that, and how, because an album that came out in 2016, how it really relates to the historical aspect?
Sure. When I'm talking about a historical consciousness, I'm not necessarily talking about Frank's intentions, mm-hmm. So much as the way that the album tells stories that are really particular to the moment that they come out, but then also draw on longer histories in American literary and popular culture. So one way you might see this in for instance, in Frank Ocean's music is the way that in Endless, and this is a little teaser for the talk, Endless, which came out in August of 2016, begins and ends with this meditation on streaming video culture and what it means, and its emphasis on the possibility for streaming life. It was a sample from a German techno artist. But the consciousness that I'm interested in is how that then engages with the way streaming has worked in US culture. Very recently, in particular, with the way that there have been a lot of streaming videos of people getting killed by the police, in particular black folks being killed by the police, and that ties into a much longer history of American culture. The spectacle of black suffering and black death that gets circulated through various media channels. That runs back through the lynchings that went up through the 1950s, and then all the way back through slavery times. Right. And that's really what I'm trying to get at with the historical consciousness, is that thinking about the way that this music engages with its moment puts it into conversation with different kinds of moments than we might expect.
Right. So I think that kind of segues sort of into my next question, which is, how strongly do you feel that the current American political scene, and maybe not just American, but musical scene and how politics is used in music, parallels the 1960s, which are kind of, the end-all, be-all, popularly considered, of politics and music, going hand in hand. So how strongly do you feel those either parallel or differ from one another?
I see a couple of important connections between our contemporary moment and the 60s, in particular, the way that folks have understood music to be a form of consciousness raising, in that a lot of people turn to music to get either involved or invigorated or learn about various kinds of activist activities. But both from my research that I do outside of the contemporary pop music stuff and from my teaching, what I see is a history that extends much before the 60s, especially back to, say, the blues singers of the 1920s, who were, as Angela Davis, the black feminist author and prison abolitionist, writes, she writes about how these artists use personal stories to create a political vision that the artists might not even understand as a political vision, but that connect their personal economic and racial conditions to a larger way of American life. And so I would use the 60s as a pivot. That's a moment when there were some ways that music expanded in how it was broadcast and how it was circulated. But I would bring it back to the 20s and then even back further to, say, the spirituals and the way that that music was used also as a force for social change.
Right. So how, like, the experience of an artist can unwillingly be sort of a zeitgeist, in a sense.
Sure, and I think that I have focused especially on the way that the music represents and narrates stories, and even maybe a little bit less on the experience of a particular artist, but the music as a form of storytelling.
Okay. I guess you kind of touched on this earlier, but how do you use and draw from music in academia?
You mean like how do
like
I
personally, like the experiences you've had, or in what style you do?
Okay. I study a wide range of American musical genres, but I grew up as a musician. I'm not sure if this is the question, like, what's my personal experience with the music, or
Like,
how do I address it?
Not how do you address it, more like how you utilize it, I guess, is probably the best one.
Sure. Let's see, I use music as, again, that ties into, like, I think about music as a form of storytelling, whether it's actual lyrical storytelling or musical storytelling, in that a song works because it's a narrative. It has a beginning and a middle and an end, and it sequences events and lyrics, and also chord changes and melodies and such. And I pay attention to the way that musical genres and musical phrases, tap into stories that people tell about the American social scene. So for instance, something like, in the 19th century, people don't tend to know this now, but in the 19th century, some European classical music was especially deeply connected to white bourgeois femininity. And that's in particular like the nocturne genre. And so I might look at a novel and consider how it represents that music in relation to the race relations of the moment that novel is depicting in, like, the early 20th century.
Right. I guess last question here on a bit of a lighter question. What album or artist would you say has been the biggest personal influence on yourself?
Oh, that is a tough question.
Right, maybe a little bit more socially light, but maybe a little bit more.
I like it. No, I like that question.
Yeah.
Oh man. What's that?
I was going to say, I asked because your talks about, obviously, Frank Ocean, and while I wasn't the biggest fan of Blonde, Chanel Orange is hands down one of my favorite albums of all time.
Yeah, that album is pretty great. I actually have to say that if I'm going to go to music that has been, like, the most formative to me, it would probably be not a particular album, but a mixtape of soul music, mostly, that my parents had, that we used to listen to in the car all the time when I was younger. And these songs, it was this mixtape of all sorts of Motown artists that really introduced me to a wide variety of genres and gave me a sense of how different artists interplayed with each other from the 60s.
Right. Well, I'd like to thank you for your time and joining us here on In Focus. This is Dr. Alex Corey. You can catch his talk tonight at 7 p.m. at the Mark Center. I'm Tim Silvia, and thank you again for tuning into this episode of In Focus, presented by Hood College Broadcasting.
Thanks.
All right. I think we call.